So welcome to Lesson 3, Domain 1 Security and Risk Management, Exam Practice Questions. Now we're going to be going through a series of questions, and I'm going to walk you through both the answers and how I would approach those questions. So question 1, the terminology associated with this type of risk assessment is scenario-based and descriptive. Now remember earlier on, I talked about the fact that when you're approaching the exam, one of the tricks is to just see if you can answer the question before you even read the answers, because it may tap directly into your knowledge. If that doesn't work, well, you always want to answer your questions, and you're not penalized for getting a wrong answer. So you don't want to skip any. At worst, you have a 1 in 4, and at best, you know it right off the bat, and otherwise, maybe we start eliminating. So again, the terminology associated with this type of risk assessment is scenario-based and descriptive. Well, maybe you thought, oh gosh, I can't remember what that is. Well, then let's start eliminating. If you look at your 4 choices, and you're always going to want to read your answers, subjective, qualitative, NIST compliant, and quantitative. Well, right off the bat, you can probably get rid of 2, because remember we talked about the 2 primary types of risk assessments are qualitative and quantitative. So if we eliminate subjective and we eliminate NIST compliant, well, now you've got a 50-50 chance. And now it's a matter of going back and really thinking about this. Was it qualitative or quantitative? And perhaps you can remember what one of them was. Quantitative was the one that we worked through with all of our various calculations, so it must be qualitative. Now, the other way to do it, remember, was if you just said type of risk assessment is scenario-based and descriptive, if you just went, hey, that's qualitative, well, good, you can mark that. But remember, always read all of the answers before making your final choice. Okay, so which of the following formulas is correct? This would be the type of a question I would expect you to get. Remember, we talked about 3 formulas. We talked about ALE, SLE, and cost-benefit. So right off the bat, as you go through these, you should be able to eliminate what's not even a formula. Remember, ARO was going to be annualized rate of occurrence. That's just a static number. That's not a formula. AV, that's the asset value, and while there are a number of pieces that can make up that value, that wasn't a formula we looked at either. ALE, that was a formula. ALE, annualized loss expectancy, equals SLE, single loss expectancy, times ARO. Sounding good. Really like that answer, but let's make sure we read all 4 answers. Now we get SLE equals EF times ARO. Exposure factor times the annualized rate of occurrence, that doesn't make any sense. Matter of fact, the correct one would be SLE equals EF times asset value, if we were going to correct that particular calculation. So let's go back to the answer that we thought was correct, and it still is correct, which is ALE equals SLE times ARO. And we're off to our next question. Now you might run into some drag and drop questions, as I showed you earlier. Remember, drag and drop are really just a fancy way of having multiple choice. And really, we're almost getting 2 different multiple choices here. Our first multiple choice would be, in a quantitative risk assessment, which of the following describes likelihood, and which of the following describes impact. So don't get nervous about these. They're just another way of presenting a multiple choice. So in a quantitative risk assessment, something describes likelihood and something else describes impact. Well, if we go through cost doesn't make any sense. ARO, annualized rate of occurrence. Remember, that was how often something might happen, right? So that's going to be the likelihood, or how often it would happen. Probability, kind of a good answer, but probability describes likelihood. Probability wasn't a term we really used. Magnitude describes impact. Well, we sometimes talk about the magnitude of impact, but remember, we're talking about a quantitative risk assessment here, so we want to look for the terms that has a lot to do with a quantitative risk assessment. So that's going to be our EF, or our exposure factor. So in a quantitative risk assessment, that's our key, ARO, annualized rate of occurrence, describes likelihood, and exposure factor describes impact. On to the next. Which of the following choices best describes a risk management activity? Now here's an interesting one, because as you read through your choices, you're saying, well, all of these are kind of risk management. Identifying associated vulnerabilities, calculating annualized rate of occurrence, authorizing risk assessment, reviewing previous risk assessments. And you might say, hey, those are all kind of part of my risk management program. But when we describe a top-level activity like risk management, what you want to do is you want to look for the more managerial activity. So who in the organization can really do something managerial, I guess we'll use that term again. So identifying associated vulnerabilities, calculating annualized rate of occurrence, well, those are really part of the risk assessment process, but not necessarily a management process. Authorizing risk acceptance, definitely going to be a management process. Or reviewing previous risk assessments could be, but better chance that authorizing risk acceptance is going to be the right answer. This one's a confusing one, and you may want to take out a piece of paper and a pencil and work on this, because we're going to get lots of numbers here and you're going to have to figure out a piece of the equation. The cost-benefit calculation for a new control is negative $9,000. That means when they did the cost-benefit, there was a loss of $9,000, which would have told us that we don't really have a benefit, that the cost is greater than the benefit. So assuming an ALE1 is $30,000 and ALE2 is $19,000, the question is, what's the cost of the new control? Well, if you're writing this down, remember that when we're doing our cost-benefit, it's ALE1 minus ALE2, so the difference between ALE1 and ALE2, minus the cost of the new control is going to give us our cost-benefit. So what are we missing? Well, we have ALE1 and ALE2, which would be $30,000 minus $19,000 is $11,000. And we know that in this case that $11,000 minus something, the cost of the new control, is negative $9,000. So the difference between a positive $11,000 and negative $9,000 is going to be $20,000. So you're going to have wanted to write this one down. Write it down. You've got a board that you can write it or a marker on. Write the equation, see what's missing, and then fill it in. On to our next. Another drag and drop. This time they're telling us to complete the equation. Well, if we have an equation, we know we're going to have our three factors. So this was SLE, single loss expectancy. It'd be really helpful if you say, I know what an SLE is. SLE is going to be AV times EF. But if you can't remember it that way, you might start looking at the others and start trying to just narrow it down. We know an SLE has nothing to do with replacement costs necessarily, so we're going to get rid of that. You really haven't seen impact factor as one of your calculations. ALE is after we've calculated our SLE. ARO is annualized rate of occurrence. So as we start thinking these through, let's start with, well, that single loss expectancy was going to be our asset value, and it's going to be our asset value times our exposure factor. So you want to eliminate the other ones and also be on the lookout for when abbreviations are used and when they're not. AV might be written as asset value or AV. Exposure factor might be written as exposure factor or EF. So even in the acronyms, make sure you always know what the acronyms stand for. All right, on to our next. Anytime Booksellers has determined that they would lose customers if their e-commerce website was unavailable for more than 3 minutes. Loss or corruption of more than 2 minutes of data is unacceptable. Which of the following best describes the requirements? Now they're talking to us about RTOs, recovery time objectives, RPOs, recovery point objectives, and MTD, maximum tolerable downtime. Those are all the components in our answer. So if we go back through our question, what they're really telling us that we can't have this website unavailable for more than 3 minutes. That's telling us our maximum tolerable downtime is 3 minutes. And they're saying that they can only afford to lose no more than 2 minutes of data. So loss or corruption more than 2 minutes of data. So our recovery point objective, data is recovery point, right? So our recovery point objective is going to be 2 minutes. So I would write these down just to make it clear so I don't get confused, that my MTD, my maximum tolerable downtime, is 3, and my recovery point objective, or my RPO, is 2. So let's try to find an answer where our MTD is 3 and our RPO is 2. And it looks like right here, RPO equals 2, MTD equals 3. Now they're going to try to trip you up a little bit. Look, we have one that's just the opposite. MTD equals 2, RPO equals 3. So write down your answer and then read through your answers slowly to make sure that you are making the right choice. All right, off to our next one. Now, you may get some drag and drop that's going to require you to put items in the correct order. You'll also notice over on the right-hand side of my screen that I have a scroll bar. You want to be on the lookout for that because a scroll bar tells you that there's more than what you see on the screen, and you want to make sure that you don't miss those answers or those pieces there. So, really what they're saying is we need to arrange the following in the correct order. But it's not even telling us what the process is. So I need to start looking through the question. Let's see, reporting to management, could be anything. Identifying essential services and MTD, maximum tolerable downtime. Maybe this is a BIA, let me continue on. Recovery point objective, determining the current objectives. That should then trip off to me that, oh, this is definitely the process for a BIA. So let's put the BIA in the correct order. Well, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to identify our essential services. Now, if you remember back in our flow chart, we're going to identify essential services, and then the next step was identify the maximum tolerable downtime. Don't be surprised if you see steps combined, in this case, identify essential services and maximum tolerable downtime, and don't let that throw you off. So the next thing we said we needed to do, because these were business decisions, was determine the recovery point objective. So we've made our business decisions on essential services, maximum tolerable downtime, and our recovery point objective. We then needed to identify our infrastructure and dependencies, so I'm dragging that into number 3. Then we're going to say, well, okay, that's what we need. What do we really have, though? That's where we're going to determine the current RPO, the RTO, and WRT, right? The current recovery point objective, recovery time objective, and work recovery time. We'll conduct a gap analysis between our desired state and our current state and report to management. So identify essential services and MTD, determine the recovery point objective, identify the infrastructure and the dependencies, determine the current RPO, RTO, and WRT, conduct the gap analysis, and report to management. And there you go. So let's move on to the next. So question 9, which of the following is least relevant to a BIA discussion? Now, we want to pick up on the word least, and that a BIA is a business impact analysis. So let's read our 4 answers. Current restore and recovery timeframes, non-essential business processes, infrastructure, and dependencies. Now, our answer is going to be non-essential business processes. But you want to be careful, because if you had read that quickly, you might have read it as essential business processes and then been tempted to choose another answer, which would have been wrong. So we're going to choose our second answer here, non-essential business processes. And number 10 is going to be a hotspot question. Now, a hotspot question, as I discussed earlier, is one where you're going to be given a diagram or pictures, and you're going to have to point to the correct answer. Now, again, here we've got a scroll bar, so that tells us we're going to have to scroll down to see all our choices. Really important, because if you didn't scroll down, you might only see the 3. So Anytime Booksellers has determined that they can tolerate 0.01% downtime for their website. So they're telling us that they really have to be up almost all of the time, matter of fact, 99.99%. And they're asking you which architecture would best suit their requirement. Now, this is a question I would expect to see in our disaster recovery area, or talking about business continuity or business impact analysis, and thinking about what are the various options. Now, these were things that we didn't cover in the lessons, but things that you need to know. So they're saying a hot site, which is another site that has all of my systems, and maybe I'm replicating some data to. A reciprocal site, a site that I say, well, you can use my site, company B, if I can use your site. Maybe having a virtualized environment, that's cool. That allows us to stand up servers quickly. A multi-site, high availability cluster. Wow, that's telling us that we are geographically dispersed. We have high availability for quick failover, and it's in a cluster, so we're not dependent just on any one system. Or out in the cloud. All are fairly reasonable choices for having good options, but really what we wanted to say is probably the multi-site, high availability cluster. Now, with a drag and drop, if you put your pointer in the wrong place, don't panic. You can always grab the pointer and move it to the choice that you want. So congratulations, you passed. We got 100% off and running. Good job. See you in the next lesson.